Well, we finally made it to Second World War. And before we get started, I got a couple of things I want to mention to you. This slide, this particular chapter isn't really that much longer than any other slide, but we're fortunate to be living in the time frame that we are because we have captured films of Germany and captured films of Japan, so we can know what's going on from their point of view also. And number two, like I said, this isn't that much longer, but I've got several YouTubes. Now, the longest one I think is 4.5 minutes, and that's toward the end of the lecture. The rest of them are ranging from 1 minute to 3 minutes. They're very short, but since most of you are young, you don't know anybody that was in World War II unless it was your great-grandparents. And in all honesty, the men who fought in World War II, they just don't talk about it. They'll talk about Vietnam, they'll talk about Korea, but they just don't talk about World War II because it was such a horrible war. This should never have happened. That being said, let's get started on this. Well, if I can, where's my little, there we go. Now, this introduction is just to tell you pretty much what we're going to be covering here pretty shortly. Something called the unexpected German-Soviet Pact. They had been enemies for centuries. They do not get along. They've been at war. But Hitler didn't want to fight a two-sided war, one on the east and one on the west, so he needed to do something to pacify the Soviets to keep them away from attacking him when he had plans on invading Poland, because Poland and Russia were supposed to be allies. So he makes this pact with them. And the Soviets had participated in something called a Popular Front against fascism. See, they're communists, and there's a difference between communism and fascism or Nazism. And Hitler used relentless anti-communist propaganda. Even in his book he wrote, Mein Kampf, he wanted to take over Russia and have it be a feeding ground and a living room for his German people. And the Soviets and Germans had both backed opposite sides during the Spanish Civil War. But Stalin, and I don't like Stalin, he's not a very nice man, but looking at him as a leader of a country, he wasn't prepared to fight Germany. So he needs to do something to stall, if you would, to give him some time to regroup and rearm and get ready, knowing full well that Hitler is never going to honor a pact for very long. But in August 23rd of 1939, two gentlemen, one from Russia and one from Germany, they signed something called the Molotov-Ribbentrop Agreement, which agreed to divide Poland between Germany and the Soviet Union and have Germany and Russia be non-aggressive enemies. Germany then turned around next month and invaded Poland on September the 1st, and that was the actual beginning of the war. But let's look at what's going on. Now, the Germans thought the world was surrounded by weak democracies in the West and that dreaded communism in the East, while the Western nations all looked at fascism and they saw it as a threat to their way of life and their visions of justice, which were based on ancient Western respect for humans and the rule of law. Meanwhile, the USSR thought the whole world was threatened by capitalist-driven industrial countries, which were determined to destroy the hopes of the communists to create a much more just world. So you've got the Germans and the Western nations and the USSR all looking at government differently. But that isn't just the only problem, because in the 20th century, technology had increased so much, especially after World War I. Now, World War II should be understood as a war about raw materials, as the armies are continued to be fed by the military-industrial capacity, because we're growing more, which is going to help our economies, but it's all to feed the army. When I feed, I don't mean just food, I mean supplies. And if you have a total war, which this is going to become, it's going to threaten your civilian population, no matter how close or how far away they are from the actual front lines. So, in all reality, World War II should be looked at as a war about racism. And that very fact brought countries in that didn't want to go to war. But you had whole populations of gypsies, Jews, homosexuals, Slavics, people who were disabled, people who were not of the right religion. They were all targeted and exterminated. So all nations are going to fight with their view of racial superiority over their enemies. But the Versailles peace settlement had really created many more problems than it solved. Now, President Wilson had that 14-point plan where he wanted all the satellite states in Eastern Europe to be able to be self-sufficient and form their own government. And that wasn't going to happen because the countries that controlled them were not going to give up the control. But Hitler's initial actions sounded pretty good. All he wanted to do was restore the German-speaking people who'd been forced to live in other nations that had just been created. He wanted to restore them to Germany and restore the German people's failure of self-determination. Sounds very lofty. Sounds like a good goal. Just restore the German-speaking people. But you've got to realize that there were people speaking German in countries that weren't in Germany, that had never belonged to Germany. And then the Allies blockade Germany. Well, Germany had been forced to accept the entire total war guilt of World War I and forced to pay rather high reparations to all the nations who thought she was guilty for the disaster of World War I. They formed the League of Nations that was supposed to be an alliance of the victors against the vanquished and to see that this never happened again. Well, they failed to create any binding standards for peace and security. In 1928, the Foreign Minister of France and the Secretary of State of the United States got together, Mr. Kellogg and Mr. Brandt, and they came up with a plan and had 62 different nations sign this pact. They were going to outlaw war and make it an international crime. Cool. That'll end war, won't it? We'll just make a law saying you can't do it. Well, who's going to enforce this pact? The League of Nations can't. She doesn't have any authority. The other nations aren't going to. It reminds me of kind of like spitting up a rope. I mean, it looks good on paper, but it's not worth the paper it's written on. And the League of Nations was never a league of all nations, and especially the United States, which never signed it, even though it's a forerunner of the United Nations. Well, because of all the reparations Germany had to pay, of course, their recovery was very slow. Then you had the Depression, which just intensified nationalism and social unrest. There were those high tariffs that had to be paid, and there was tensions between management and labor that were very high. And the battle between the right and the left politically, well, it was polarized. But the final blow to Weimar Germany was the Depression. So Germany, under the leadership of Hitler, ignored the provisions of the Versailles Treaty and began to rearm. Well, while she's doing this, in Japan. And Japan is a beautiful, not one island, it's a series of islands, and it's beautiful. I lived there for several years, and it's beautiful, but they have no natural resources. Everything they need, from iron to, well, they have plenty of water and rice, but that's about it. And you can't win a battle by throwing rice at people. So they had to do something. And the United States had been selling them all they needed. Our scrap metal, oil, whatever they needed, we would sell them. But we were starting to cut back and not want to sell anything that has to do with war or fighting, like fuel for your airplanes or bullets for your guns. So they decided that they needed more land. They needed something else. So they decided to invade China, the region called Manchuria, which was the industrialized region of northeastern China, which they did. And they said they were forming a greater Pacific co-prosperity sphere. And when they received written condemnations from all the nations, they said, well, you don't like us invading Manchuria. Okay, we'll just change the name, which they changed the name from Manchuria to Manchukuo. I don't know what the world that was supposed to accomplish, but it was just a Japanese ploy. Meanwhile, the building up of arms, which aided the economy, but it's using up an awful lot of your nations, all the different nations, that didn't sound right, all the different national, okay, let's go back and just do national expenditures. That sounds better. Building up their arms, yes, it aided the economy. It gave people a place to go to work, and things are going better, but you're doing it on a military basis. Germany's economy becomes the strongest in Europe, aided by use of Spain and Austria and Czechoslovakia, where she tried out her new weapons and also aided them, and they aided back. And then Mussolini in Italy. He wants to be big dog on the porch. He wants a colonial power. He wants to be a part of the colonial organization. And he had tried to invade Ethiopia a couple of decades before this, but, well, not he hadn't, but Italy had. And he got his little Italian butt kicked. What is the only area of land in Africa that has not been, shall we say, claimed by one of the European nations. So he tries it again in 1935. Okay, it's not 19,350. It's that zero should not be there. I'm sorry. As perfect as I am, I do occasionally make a typing error. So Mussolini invaded Ethiopia in 1935 and was successful. And the letters of condemnation flowed. An all-white nation had invaded an all-black nation. The African Americans in the United States were furious, begging us to do something. Of course, just like everything else, it's still the midst of the Depression. Nobody wants to tackle Mussolini or Hitler. So I think Stalin was probably the only one who really had a good idea of what Hitler was like. And we were afraid of him. We were afraid of Germany, and not just, when I say we, I mean all the Western nations. A war would just devastate us. Now, in Italy and Nazi Germany got together and formed the Axis, and later Japan joined. Spanish ultranationalists and the Spanish Civil War were, like I say, Germany and Russia aided different sides. The Spanish had declared neutrality from the very beginning, but they did favor the Axis. And there were authoritarian regimes in Yugoslavia, in Hungary, in Romania, and Poland. And of course, the special case of Czechoslovakia, remaining Western in their feeling and semi-democratic, but everybody's looking at her with very hungry eyes. Now, it's been called, the 1930s has been called the dishonest decade, because it was challenges to peace, appeasement, and dishonesty. The fascist and nationalistic aggression was seen by some as a challenge to civilization, and it needed to be met with force. Others said, no, we're still, suffering from World War I, and what we need to do is to talk. So the 1930s was called a low, dishonest decade by Dr. W.H. Alden. He was right. Appeasement. Now, this was grounded on three assumptions. One, that the outbreak of another world war was totally unthinkable, and it was. And the British and American arguments that Germany had been mistreated at Versailles and forced to pay full high reparations and forced to take the total blame when it wasn't she who even fired the first shot. And the fascist states that we didn't really like, but they was kind of a bulwark, a kind of a fence between us and the Soviet communism. So these are good grounds. You don't want to go to war. But then you have the debate, which is worse, the Soviets or the Germans, the fascists or the communists? Neither one of them are something that we like, but better the devil you know, right? Japan and Italy tested the League of Nations when Japanese invasion of China. And now this film, you're going to find it very, almost sickening. But it's the nicest one I could find to demonstrate what happened. Because you hear about the Holocaust in Europe, but you don't really hear much about the rape of Nanjing. If this offends you, just turn your eyes and turn the volume down while it's on. Oh my, see, the film isn't even as long as it's going to take to bring it up. I think it's 3 minutes. I was right, 3 minutes.
The Rape of Nanjing. The Rape of Nanjing occurred for 2 months between December 1937 to January 1938 as a result of the Second Sino-Japanese War. For decades, the Japanese had been industrializing and preparing an imperial army ever since the Meiji Restoration in 1868. Because China had been so isolated for centuries since the Ming Dynasty in 1433, they were not able to experience the technological and militaristic developments that occurred all around them in the Americas, Europe, and their next-door neighbor, Japan. Occurring at the same time as World War II, the Japanese began their invasion of China in 1937, starting with Shanghai, a major trading city, and making their way into Nanjing, the Chinese capital, where the Japanese thoroughly destroyed their Chinese opponents. The Chinese defense had surrendered in hopes of mercy, but their surrender brought on just the opposite. This surrender was seen as a sign of shame by the Japanese Imperial Army. Thus, they began to punish their weak Chinese prisoners and elevate their own honor. Ordered by General Matsui, the Japanese Imperial Army began wreaking widespread havoc across the once great city of Nanjing. Nobody was able to escape the punishingly brutal treatment brought onto them by the Japanese. Men, women, children, and the elderly were all captured, tortured, and murdered. Homes were invaded as the soldiers began to occupy Nanjing. Chinese men were often taken into the streets and decapitated publicly in front of their families. The Japanese soldiers viewed this as a game or sport. Elderly women were raped and left to die, and young women were often kept as comfort women for the soldiers who were raped continuously after being taken away from their families. Children were often slaughtered in front of their parents and siblings. The Japanese soldiers often encouraged, if not forced, tens of thousands of Chinese inhabitants into heroin and opium addictions regardless of their age, further breaking down Nanjing society. These prisoners of war were forced to bury their dead relatives or, even worse, their living friends and family. The only relief program in the city of Nanjing came from a small group of 20 doctors, missionaries, and businessmen from America and Europe who established a 2.5 square mile international safe zone, which the soldiers were forbade to enter. Thousands of desperate Chinese struggled to reach the safe zone. Some did, while others didn't. Because no formal records were kept on the occurrence, the rape of Nanjing does not have an exact number of victims attached to it. However, it can be estimated that around 200 to 300,000 people were killed, while many others were wounded, tortured, raped, and orphaned. Relief workers described the place as a hell on earth, with corpses lining the blood-soaked streets. The only true relief came towards the end of the Sino-Japanese War, when the troops were recalled to Japan, leaving Nanjing broken, uncompensated, and violated.
Disgusting? Yes. This war was a horrible war, and it was a racism. The Japanese and the Chinese people hate each other. Mussolini, like I said, invaded Ethiopia because he wanted to restore Italy to the glory of ancient Rome. The League imposed sanctions on Italy, but there was no enforcement. Then there was a Spanish Civil War between 36 and 39. A very weak Republican government could not overcome the opposition, and Hitler and Mussolini both sent troops to assist Franco. And the Soviets sided with the communists fighting for the Spanish Republic. And Britain and France and the United States did nothing. There were some volunteers, men from these people. Volunteer men who went over to help, but not with the permission of their government. Now, this little film is just a very brief, not nearly as brutal film as the Chinese one, but to help you to understand a little bit about the Spanish Civil War. It was almost a training ground.
Spanish Civil War began after an opposition declaration by the generals of the Spanish armed forces. At the time, there was a left-sided government in power, led by Manuel Anza, which supported a democratic Spain. The coup was generally supported by groups to the right of the political arena and was led by General Franco. They were known as the Nationalists. The forces led by Manuel Anza were known as the Loyalists. General Franco ruled from 1939 until his death in 1975. When the coup started, the Nationalists failed to take objectives in Madrid, Barcelona and Valencia. Due to the failure to take these parts of the country, Spain was divided and a civil war began. The Nationalists received munitions and soldiers from Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. The Loyalists received support from the Soviet Union and Mexico. The Civil War started in 1936 and finished in 1939 with a nationalist victory. The Loyalists moved to France and those that remained were persecuted by the Nationalists. The Civil War involved a large number of non-Spanish citizens who participated in combat and advisory positions. Germany sent a Luftwaffe unit and modern warplanes. Italy sent 100,000 men. Britain and France led a bloc of 27 nations that promised an embargo on all arms to Spain. The United States unofficially went along. Germany, Italy and Soviet Union were also signed on officially, but blatantly ignored the embargo. The attempted suppression of imported materials was largely ineffective. The clandestine actions of various European powers were at the time considered to be risking another Great War, alarming anti-war elements across the world. Significant numbers of volunteers originated in France, 10,000 in total, 5,000 from Germany and Austria, and 3,500 from Italy. More than 1,000 each came from the Soviet Union, the United States, the United Kingdom, Poland, Yugoslavia, Hungary and Canada. The Falman Battalion, a group of Germans, and the Garibaldi Battalion, a group of Italians, distinguished their units during the siege of Madrid. Americans fought in units such as the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, while Canadians joined the Mackenzie Papineau Battalion. On the 26th of March 1939, the Nationalists started a general offensive. On the 28th of March, the Nationalists occupied Madrid, and by the 31st of March they controlled all the Spanish territory. Franco proclaimed victory in a radio speech aired on the 1st of April 1939 when the last of the Loyalist forces surrendered.
Like I said, they had volunteers that showed up from England, France, the United States, Canada, all over the place, but the government was not officially behind them. That was something that they didn't really want to get involved in. Like I said, it was pointed out, they were afraid it's going to be the preamble to another war. Spain was a dress rehearsal. They tested the new weapons and skills, German dive bombers. It was a complete victory for Franco. But Britain and France were reluctant to admit Republican refugees. Now, this is the same as I think it's going to happen at the end of the war. People do not want to admit the Jewish refugees. But Franco sent over 1 million of his opponents to the prison or camps or execution. So what did Hitler learn? That Britain, France, and the Soviet Union is going to have a hard time containing them. And Britain and France would do anything to avoid another war. This just shows you the Spanish Civil War. I don't question you too much on that. I just want you to know that it was basically a dress rehearsal. Meanwhile, in the 30s, German rearmament and the policies of appeasement. First thing he did was remove Germany from the League of Nations. Then he defied the disarmament provisions of the Versailles Treaty, and 2 years later. And his stated goal was always the unification of all ethnic Germans. But he reoccupied the Rhine Line in 1936, which is the industrial area between Germany and France. France and Britain did nothing. Then he annexed Austria in 1938. No reaction. Then he declared his intention to occupy the Sudetenland, which is the German-speaking part of Czechoslovakia. Well, the German military high command actually tried to persuade Hitler to wait and let's have a few more years to rebuild our army and chain. But Hitler was not to be dissuaded. Enter Neville Chamberlain. Now, Neville Chamberlain is the Prime Minister of England. In September the 29th, in 1938, in Munich, in Czechoslovakia, a representative from France, a representative from Italy, Germany, and England met, and Chamberlain was the Prime Minister of England. He actually went there. And Hitler assured them all he wanted to do was reunify the German-speaking peoples. So Chamberlain and the rest of them said, well, you know, that's not a bad goal. I mean, if that's all you want to do, we understand that, and we will not make any waves. But Chamberlain returns to England, and he's proclaimed peace in our times. And everybody thought Chamberlain was so good. He got Hitler to agree not to do anything other than just reunite the German-speaking people. Well, it didn't take very long. Less than a year later, Germany invaded all of Czechoslovakia, even the people who did not speak German. And he creates a nation of Slovakia, which satisfied the people that had been unhappy with the creation of a Czechoslovakia by the Treaty of Versailles. And he convinced the Western public of the futility of appeasement. I mean, Hitler's going to say one thing and do something else. And Britain and France jointly guaranteed sovereignty of Poland and Romania. You know, appeasement's not going to work, so we'll just have to take a step forward. Stalin feared the West might strike a deal with Hitler, and he knows he's got to do something. So in August of 1939, he and the Germans signed a pact of non-aggression. And part of this pact was Stalin was promised a share of Poland, Finland, and the Baltic states. And they were not going to attack each other. Well, we both know how that turned out. But it was going to give Russia a warm water port, which she wanted desperately. Oh, I went the wrong way, didn't I? Okay, let's go the other way. Okay. Hitler demanded the abolition of the Polish quarter and give back old German lands with the majority of the German people living there. It's the area that connects Germany to the old Prussian lands in the Baltic area. Poland said no. So Hitler said, okay. On September the 1st, 1939, Hitler invades Poland. Well, this time it went too far. Britain and France both immediately declared war within 2 days on Germany, starting the World War II in the European theater. And this is a German word. It's two words, Blitz and Krieg. Blitz is lightning and Krieg is war. It's what it says, lightning war. Now, there's a difference between Blitzkrieg and the Blitz, which we'll get to shortly. But Blitzkrieg is lightning war, and it was a type of strategy that the world had never seen before. Soviet troops then invaded from the east, coming into Poland. So Poland fell within 4 weeks. But the Western armies never attacked Germany. I think it's a very brief film of the fall and what happens to Poland. Now, Poland right now is pretty much a Jewish nation. And most of the people there don't speak German, they speak Polish. But it's the position of the land that Hitler wanted. Now, this is captured German film.
Poland, September 1939.
Oops.
The German foe begins its ruthless march of conquest and sets the stage for World War II. Poland's 34 million inhabitants, crushed, scattered, and enslaved. Tens of thousands of square miles of territory shrink before the movement of lightning armored columns. Poland and the world learn the meaning of a grim new word, Blitzkrieg. Here is shown the initiation of that phase of modern warfare. These pictures of the preparation for attack and later the actual combat were all made by German frontline cameramen. Therefore, they stress Nazi superiority. Success is unimpeded as Hitler's divisions move against outnumbered Polish defenders. Later, on other world battlefronts, the Allies are to destroy the myth of the invincibility of the Nazi armies. But this is Hitler at the peak of his armed might, and the record of a nation overrun in just days is of military as well as historical importance. The spark is set off in the free city of Danzig. Nazi secret agents had long plotted the revolt against law and order. Germany called it liberation. The world knew that Danzig represented the ignition of the European powder keg, the excuse for Hitler's hordes to begin their destructive campaign of conquest. Here is the historic last stand of Danzig's loyal defenders. They're entrenched in the city's post office and under repeated fire of Nazi-trained militiamen. Taking cover behind an advancing tank, the attackers move in. Gasoline is sprayed on the building, and its doom is sealed. On September 1st, Danzig is incorporated into the Reich, and all Europe is aflame. World War II is a reality. Nazi regulars move up. The Germans brazenly call it counterattack with pursuit. The civilized world knows it as the unleashing of unheard-of military might. With little to stand in their way, the Nazi divisions roar across the Polish countryside and reveal for the first time the machines and weapons that are to terrorize a freedom-loving people. Military observers see the Nazi lightning warfare as setting the style for modern battle. Only a well-devised counter-blitz can stem the flanking and pincer movements of the wily Germans. The motorcycles bring up machine gunners for the opening of the attack. Camouflage is used to best advantage. Tanks speed the advance as the Polish town is about to fall. Before the day is out, the Nazis have occupied the town, which is still burning and in complete ruin. Wrecked equipment testifies to the Polish rout. There's no halt in the wrecked town. The military timetable calls for the rushing up of troops for more blitz attacks. The German strategy is to isolate Polish forces as quickly as possible. So the Nazi columns move according to prearranged schedule. 30 to 37 miles per day is the German plane. A strategic bridge across the Vistula River has been blown up by retreating Polish soldiers. But in their haste, they were unable to ensure its complete destruction. The enemy will be delayed, but temporary repair is not impossible for skilled mechanics to accomplish in fast time. A German sapper detachment sent ahead of the fighting unit goes to work. These men are trained to construct emergency roads as well as bridges. The hastily constructed span is quickly put to use by the advancing Nazis. units don't even wait for the repairs. When bridges are scarce, shallow waters are forded. The German generals even defy fatigue. Long lines of tired troops are kept moving against the foe. The operation is based on the principle that contact once made should never be lost. Snaps are snatched on the move. Complete halt comes only during the lull between battle movements. At all times, weapons are kept clean and ready for instant use. This enemy of ours has mastered every technique necessary to the maintenance of efficient fighting contingents. The Polish harbor of Gdynia. For the defense of this vital seaport, the Poles have sunk ships to block the entrance of German warships. The Nazis direct their fire across the harbor. Military and naval forces are cooperating to bring about complete destruction of Polish defense installations. After a thorough bombardment, the outnumbered garrison of Gdynia surrendered. The Nazi air arm plays a major role in the wanton destruction of Polish territory. The method is now a familiar one. First reconnaissance planes go aloft to secure valuable photographic data. The aerial pictures will show the movement and position of Polish troops, and also the undefended sectors that will supply easy targets for Nazi bombs. Immediately on landing, valuable pictures are rushed to the field developing unit. Germans have stated that information thus revealed has formed the base for much of their decisive military operations in Poland. This photograph reveals a truck convoy, closely bunched at a crossroad. If proper distance and interval had been kept between vehicles, they would not be the target shown here. Ground and Air Force raids are worked out with greater unity through the use of the aerial photograph.
I'm sorry, I forgot that this one was that long. But like I said, this was German film captured, and it was one thing you didn't see was when they would take over these towns, they would round up the town's leader, the mayor, and the councils and stuff, put them against the wall and shoot them. This was not shown. You didn't see any dead German soldiers, and there was, of course, response. The Poles were trying to defend themselves, so there would have been dead soldiers. But you didn't see this because this is film shot for propaganda to be shown in Germany to show the German people how superior the German army was. Well, as soon as they got there, they immediately separated the Jews and established a very puppet government. The Russians began deportations, imprisonments, and executions. But the phony war saw no activity during the winter except the USSR invasion of Finland. Finland held out for 4 months, but the Russian troops did win, but the weakness of their forces was becoming apparent. They're not prepared for all-out war. Germany finally invades into Scandinavia, seeking to protect against a possible British blockade, as in World War I. And in May of 1939, the war in the West begins. The Germans invade through Belgium and the Netherlands. Kind of a new version of the Schieffelin Plan, where they're going to go through Belgium to take Paris. If you take Paris, you've got France. The French army was completely overwhelmed by the German blitzkrieg. They were not prepared either, and so many of the refugees did flee south. Dunkirk, 300,000 British and French troops were evacuated to England. And that's a statement that it's hard to believe, because the English Channel, when they saw that they were being overwhelmed by the German troops, they were going to evacuate backwards. But the English Channel had bad weather, and they could not get their ships close enough to shore to evacuate these people. So the English people, the English fishermen, took boats, sometimes just a rowboat, sometimes a fishing boat, whatever they could to go, and they saved so many, 100,000 of them, just one or two at a time. It was one of the greatest examples of the civilian public helping the military. The French reservists were told to fight to the last cartridge, but it didn't work. On June the 22nd, 1940, France, in the middle of the summer, when it should have been sitting on a table drinking wine and looking at the pretty girls walking by and watching the street performers, instead you see this. It's also another example of captured German film.
Legions enter the city of light. Two days later, the French government sues for peace.
Just a side note, this is not actual German film right here. This has been interspersed with a movie of what happened. But we'll soon get back to the actual film.
What does it say? Here on the 11th of November 1918, succumbed the criminal pride of the German Empire, vanquished by the free peoples which it tried to enslave, have blown up.
Early in his rise to power, Hitler vowed to erase the shame of November 1918 at the place where the years of Germany's suffering had begun. He has kept his promise. It is his towering moment.
Read the terms.
Im Auftrag des Führers und obersten Befehlshabers der deutschen Wehrmacht habe ich Ihnen folgende Eröffnung zu machen. Wir vertrauen auf die vom amerikanischen Präsidenten Wilson, dem Deutschen Reich gegebenen und von den alliierten Mächten gegebenen Zusicherungen, hat die deutsche Wehrmacht im November 1918 Waffen niedergelegt. Damit hat im Krieg den Abschluss des deutschen Volkes die Regierung nicht gewollt hatte. Mit Franz oder Bayern.
So the first half was captured, the second half was not. The Germans occupied northern France, and southern France fell under what we call the Vichy regime, headed by Marshal Pétain, which was a picture of the general you saw sitting there at the table, looking so sad. Vichy is the name of the town that they set it up in. And the Free French movement was established in London under the leadership of Charles de Gaulle. And Vichy government came close to fascism. This is another brief one of telling you about what the Vichy government was like.
After defeating the French during the Blitzkrieg in May 1940, the Nazis left large parts of France unoccupied. The southeastern part stayed under the control of the French Vichy regime, loyal to the Nazis and Italian fascists. The leader of the regime was French Marshal Pétain. Pétain came into power after the Nazi attack. He signed a treaty with the enemy, ordered to stop all resistance, and promised full cooperation. Next to obeying German orders, Vichy authorities started to prosecute Jews even before German orders. When the Allied invasion of France started in June 1944, the Vichy government got detained by the Nazis until the end of the war. After the war, Pétain was sentenced to death. However, Charles de Gaulle, the future leader of France, changed this to a lifetime sentence. The French collaboration and role in Jewish prosecution have long been taboo in France. In 2009, the highest court in France ruled that Vichy authorities were responsible for the death of at least 76,000 Jews.
That's what most of them are, that length. If you ever get a chance to take a course in French history, believe me, the area called World War II is extremely exciting and interesting. The Battle of Britain began July 1940 to June 1941. Generals in the German army had suggested to Hitler to go ahead and cross the Channel and invade England, but Hitler decided that the English were the closest to the Aryans as he was, almost. They just needed to be taught a lesson. So they're going to attempt to establish air superiority before invading. A little more than 40,000 civilians, of course, were killed, and the British forced a stalemate in the air. The British Air Force was small, had smaller planes, fewer people, but they could outfly the German Luftwaffe really good. They go out and do dog battles and come back and land and fuel up and take off again. Germans were determined. They weren't even hitting military bases. They were going after the big cities of London. The city of London, not the big cities of London. London is a city, not a country. But it was just an effort to scare and terrify the population and to prove their air superiority, which they never completely secured, because the English people they call themselves bulldogs, and they're very stubborn.
I'm standing on a rooftop looking out over London. At the moment, everything is quiet. For reasons of national as well as personal security, I'm unable to tell you the exact location from which I'm speaking. Off to my left, far away in the distance, I can see just that faint, red, angry snap of anti-aircraft bursts against the steel blue sky. But the guns are so far away that it's impossible to hear them from this location. About 5 minutes ago, the guns in the immediate vicinity were working. I can look across just at the building not far away and see something that looks like a splash of white paint down the side. And I know from daylight observation that about a quarter of that building has disappeared, hit by a bomb the other night. Streets fan out in all directions from here, and down on one street I can see a single red light, and just faintly the outline of a sign standing in the middle of the street. And again, I know what that sign says, because I saw it this afternoon. It says, "Danger, unexploded bomb." Off to my left still, I can see just that red snap of the anti-aircraft fire. I was up here earlier this afternoon and looking out over these housetops, looking all the way to the dome of St. Paul's. I saw many flags flying from staff. No one ordered these people to put out the flags. They simply feel like flying the Union Jack above their roofs. No one told them to do it, and no flag up there was white. I can see one or two of them just stirring very faintly in the breeze now. You may be able to hear the sound of guns off in the distance, very faintly, like someone kicking a tub. Now they're silent. 4 searchlights reach up, disappear in the light of a 3/4 moon. I should say at the moment there are probably 3 aircraft in the general vicinity of London, because one can tell by the movement of the lights and the flash of the anti-aircraft guns. But at the moment, in the central area, everything is quiet. More searchlights spring up over on my right. I think probably in a minute we shall have the sound of guns in the immediate vicinity. The lights are swinging over in this general direction now. You will hear 2 explosions. Just there they are. Again, moving in, still a considerable distance away. Moving still just a little closer. There you heard 2. The searchlights are stretching out now in this general direction. I can hear just the faint whisper of an aircraft high overhead. Again, those guns are a considerable distance away. You'll hear them just vaguely in the background. Straight in front of me now. You'll hear 2 sounds in just a moment. There they are. That was the explosion overhead, not the guns themselves. I should think in a few minutes there may be a bit of shrapnel around here. Coming in, moving a little closer all the while. The plane is still very high, and it's quite clear that he's not coming in for his bombing run. Earlier this evening, we could hear occasionally, again, those were explosions overhead. Earlier this evening, we heard a number of bombs go sliding and slithering across to fall several blocks away. Just overhead now, the burst of the anti-aircraft fire. Still, the nearby guns are not working. The searchlights now are feeling almost directly overhead. Now you'll hear 2 bursts a little nearer in a moment. There they are. That hard, stony sound.
Edward R. Murrow went on to be one of the most famous news broadcasters we had. And of course, this was radio. And why was it being broadcast? With the full support of the President of the United States, because the people of the United States didn't want to get involved. But he found that they could hear what was going on and participate in that way and not be involved. They would feel sorrow for these people, feel pity. They might want to help them. Anything he could do to stir up a little public support would be a great aid to him. Meanwhile, Winston Churchill is now the Prime Minister. Mr. Chamberlain has seen better days. He was a short little man, very talented, had big jaws, and when he spoke, his jaws would shake. And sometimes people thought he was a little bit wacky. But he knew the language, and he knew personal diplomacy. He was a great diplomat. He managed to convince FDR to break with the American neutrality that President Roosevelt had declared. They had passed 3 neutrality acts. One, they wouldn't sell any arms to anyone who was at war. Number two, the second one they passed, they would not sell any, give any loans to anybody who was at war. But then they came along and they did something called the Lend-Lease. And we agreed to lend, let London or England borrow some of our carriers and not our carriers, but our war machines that were not being used, some of the ships, the battleships and things. And one of the senators said, you know, you do this. He said, that's kind of like lending somebody your chewing gum, tell them you want it back when you get through with it. Do you really want these battleships back when they get through with them? They also signed something called cash and carry, where we won't deliver, but if you can come over here in your ship and pay cash for something, we will sell it to you. And they signed the Atlantic Charter to help them keep the Atlantic free of the U-boats. The battle in the Atlantic. Well, Germany wanted to strike first in an economic war with Britain, because they couldn't do it in the air. And they did not compete in a naval arms race due to the Versailles Treaty, so they began to focus on submarines because they didn't have that many big ships at the time. And the German submarines worked in what we called wolf packs, and they sunk millions of tons of merchant shipping trying to get into England and France. But the British began to develop sonar and new methods of aerial reconnaissance, and before you know it, they even managed to break the German code. So they're on their way. They're really working at it. In North Africa, well, they wanted to protect the Suez Canal. And in May of 41, India, and I don't mean American Indians, we're talking about India, people from the country of India, and African troops drove the Italians out of Ethiopia finally. Yay! Iraq and Iran developed fascist leanings to remove Western influence. They're Muslims, and they didn't really like all this Christianity thing. So Britain invades both the countries, keeping the oil from Germany. And they nearly took the Italian colony of Liberia, but they did force the Germans to intervene to protect their ally. The Italians weren't doing it. The Afrika Korps, under Erwin Rommel, they managed to push the British back into Egypt. But the International British Army, because she was pulling from her colonies, the Australians, the Indians, and New Zealanders, and they managed to defeat the Italian Navy in the Mediterranean. But meanwhile, we've got all these German Africa troops under Erwin Rommel, and he was a fantastic general. Well, in 1942, the Allies met in Casablanca and discussed the course of the war. They were going to try to liberate Europe first and see what deal with the fate of the French territories in North Africa. Well, this, of course, really angered Stalin because he was begging for you to have a second front in Europe. Don't do it in North Africa. We need to come help me, basically, because by this time, Hitler had reneged on his treaty. Oh, dear. I keep going the wrong way, don't I? This is Erwin Rommel. He was a German general, but he was not a Nazi. He was a fantastic tank commander. But unfortunately, Hitler learned that he was allied with a group of German officers who were trying to get rid of Hitler. So he ordered him out of Africa, back to Germany, and there he committed suicide by putting a gun to the back of his head. Meanwhile, Japan needs raw materials, so she chooses a southern strategy. She formed a non-aggression pact with Germany and with the USSR, because at that time, they're still allied with Germany and Italy. She hasn't left yet. On December the 7th, 1941, the Japanese attacked on Pearl Harbor. Their whole plan was to destroy the U.S. Pacific Fleet, and 8 battleships were sunk and over 2,000 American lives were lost. But it wasn't a complete success because the carriers, the big ships, they were all out at sea. Well, of course, once you killed Americans on American soil, it really galvanized the American public opinion. So Germany declared war on the United States, and which she then joined the Allied ships. So the United States is officially at war. The Japanese sweep through the British protectorate at Malaya. They sank British and Dutch Pacific squadrons. Singapore falls to the Japanese in December of 41, and then they invaded the Philippines, what we call Corregidor and the Death March. my father was on the way to the Philippines when the war ended. This is another unpleasant little film. If they don't give you the full background of it, I will as soon as it finishes. I do ask you a question about the Bataan Death March.
In 1941, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. The U.S. fleet was crippled. 10 hours later, across the Pacific, they attacked the Philippines, clearing the way for an overwhelming invasion of the islands. U.S. forces, including 10,000 Americans and 60,000 Filipinos, pulled back to the Bataan Peninsula. Without a navy to rescue them, and with their backs to the sea, they were trapped. Despite promises to the contrary, President Roosevelt and his military high command decided to focus first on Europe and on stopping Hitler. This strategy effectively seals the fate of the Philippines and the men trapped on Bataan. Under orders, and against his wishes, General MacArthur escapes to Australia, vowing to return. After 4 months of fighting without supplies, starving American and Filipino troops surrendered to the Japanese Imperial Army. It is the largest single defeat in the history of the American military. Unequipped to house or feed 70,000 prisoners of war, the Japanese take the weakened soldiers on a brutal 60-mile forced march. Men fall out of line, are bayoneted, shot. 15,000 perish on what would become known as the Bataan Death March. The surviving POWs are herded into various camps at O'Donnell, Cabanatuan, and Palawan. The Japanese guards view surrender as a disgrace, treat them viciously. Thousands die from disease, starvation, and abuse.
There was a lot of controversy over that because the decision being made, you can't really fight a two-front war very successfully, and they wanted to take care of Hitler in Europe. They considered him at that time a worse threat than the Japanese. Unfortunately, all the information about the atrocities the Japanese were committing had not come to light yet. This just shows you a war in the Pacific, how they're going to sweep through. They invaded Southeast Asia, and Dutch East Indies fell. They took Burma. Then William Slim, one of the British organizers, reorganized the imperial defenses, and the British and the Indian troops finally defeated the Japanese and stopped the invasion of India. In New Guinea, the Australian troops managed to stop the Japanese. The Japanese are spreading themselves awfully thin, too. The American Navy rapid production of planes and ships in 1943, and Chester Nimitz and William Halsey. I had the unpleasant experience of meeting Chester Nimitz. He was a little short, egotistical, my particular with him, he was after the war, of course, and he was on an Air Force base where my father was stationed. And Dad came home. He says, "You're not going to believe what that damn admiral did." He went out on the flight line smoking a cigar, and when they told him he couldn't, he said, planes would blow up if you got that lit cigar around here. And he said, "It wouldn't dare." Ooh. In the Coral Sea, Midway, and Guadalcanal in 1942, the battle that shipped the initiative to the U.S., and this is a little brief film about the most famous American battle and the changing of strategies of the way the Navy was going to fight.
The Battle of the Coral Sea starts with a big blow. Americans spot a Japanese carrier. They dive down through piercing anti-aircraft fire and sink it. The Japanese respond by swarming American ships. It's dogfight after dogfight, but neither side's navy can see the other. Planes do all the fighting, long distance.
The planes flew right around us, and the guns couldn't keep up. And the boys couldn't twist that gun fast enough.
Then Americans hit a second enemy carrier. But Japan responds with two mortal blows. A bomb rips through the deck of the USS Yorktown, killing 40 men. And the USS Lexington is blasted beyond repair. Both sides suffer heavy losses. But the Allies have halted Japan's momentum. Those left behind never know the historic impact of the Battle of the Coral Sea. Not once do opposing ships spot each other. Not once do they exchange a salvo. It's a new kind of naval battle, fought entirely with airplanes.
That's what I meant by a new kind of battle. Oh, excuse me. I think I'm going to sneeze here in a minute. The Coral Sea is just off of Australia, basically, and this is what the Japanese were trying to do was to, oh dear. Oh, excuse me. The Japanese were getting ready to supposedly invade Australia, but that was stopped. Now, Midway took place in the Pacific, the other ocean, 6 months after Pearl Harbor and 1 month after the Battle of Coral Sea. We're finally getting it together. They began something called island hopping, strategy they developed in 1943, and what they needed to do was to take one island back from Japan at a time. They only needed to get close enough so the air power could begin bombing. And this war, we're going to use a lot more air power than we are going to use naval ships. It was brutal warfare because each side considered the other racially inferior. Japanese would not surrender. And on these islands, if they were defeated, they would just dig holes in the ground and go in them. And there's only one way to get them out, with a flamethrower. And we have some pictures of that, which I'm not going to show, but it was brutal. But if you try to go in those tunnels after the Japanese, they're going to blow your head off. So it's a question of me or you. Now back over to the other side of the world, the German victories. And back in 1941, Germany took Yugoslavia and established a Croatian puppet state. Romania, Hungary, and Bulgaria decided it was easier to side with Germany than to fight her. Greece fought beautifully, but as I said here, stubbornly, but she just didn't have the wherewithal, the weapons, or the manpower, and she did lose. The island of Crete was captured by German paratroopers at a very high cost. They paratrooped in, and there were people waiting there to shoot them, but they did lose. So they sent some aid to Rommel in Egypt to try to take Egypt. They had to open a Middle East pathway to get the oil. And by the summer of 1941, Germany dominated the African continent. As you can see in Europe, she is growing like yeast. She's slowly taking over everything. But then she makes her fatal mistake, and she apparently did not read the history of Napoleon. On June 22nd, 1941, she began an operation to invade the Soviet Union called Operation Barbarossa. It was a multi-nation army in a war against communism. Of course, Stalin knew it was going to happen. He just didn't know when. So the war against the Soviets was characterized by the ideology and racial hatred. The Germans wanted to cleanse the undesirable elements and take over their land, and those that they don't live could be slaves to them. So Hitler diverted an attack from Moscow to the industrial south. Moscow was never taken, and Russia finally began to reorganize its defenses. And the one thing I will say about the German people, I'm not talking about communists per se, I'm talking about the people of Russia. They loved their country, to the point that they will lay down and die for their country without a second question. The war shifts in December 41 with the entry of the U.S. into the war and the failure of Germans to capture Moscow. They had into the same problem that somebody else had when they tried to go. But this new Nazi order was a patchwork affair. Europe was going to be at the top, with Germany at the top of that. And we're going to have military governments in Poland and Ukraine. They were going to have collaborative governments in France and all the allied fascists like in Hungary. And the empire was going to feed Germany and maintain moral support by occupying countries because they were forced to pay occupational costs. In other words, I'm going to pay you for taking me over. But Nazis had claimed to be uniting Europe against the Red Menace, the communism, and of course the Jews. Norway and the Netherlands, a dedicated party of citizens, joined the Nazi government and were able to govern. At the same time, there was a very well-organized resistance movement started that was very successful in their guerrilla attacks. In Denmark, the population was more united against Germans and engaged in passive resistance. There's active and passive. Active, you're going to actually go out and shoot somebody. Passive, you want to drop some soup on them or flatten their tires or something that's not going to get you killed. Any Jews that they could find in Denmark that were smuggled very safely into neutral Sweden. But in France, collaboration ranged from simple survival tactics to active support. And I can't really blame those people for doing some things to stay alive. The survival instinct is very strong in all of us. But they deported the French Jews into concentration camps. But they had resistance groups in France, and one of the largest ones were communists. And they were brutal. Some of the ordinary citizens even joined the Communist Party, but the Communist guerrilla groups. And they established contacts with the Free French, led by Charles de Gaulle in England. And they were a great help. But the problem was at the end of the war, who was going to get to Paris first? The Communist-led group? The French-led group? The American-led group? Who's going to be in Paris when the Americans arrive? In Poland, there was an armed resistance forms, but there was no collaboration. Everybody hated them. They either deported or killed most of them. The Polish Home Army's largest resistance movement in 1942. In Yugoslavia, civil war between the fascist Croats pitted against most Serbs. Ustasha, a Croatian fascist guard, massacred hundreds of thousands of Serbs, and this is going to go on after the war, too. Joseph Broz, which we call Tito, emerged as a leader of the Yugoslavia resistance. Now, he was a communist guerrilla, but, war and politics make strange bedfellows. And he got the support of us because he was against Hitler. Never mind, he was a communist. After all, we'd already taken Stalin as an ally. The most important moral issue facing the occupied country was do you do nothing? Do you look the other way? Or do you risk everything, including your own life, to help these undesirables, which were, of course, the Jews? Hitler had already outlined his war against I don't know if I can say this or not, Untermission, which is subhuman, in Mein Kampf. The Gypsies, the Jews, the Slavs. He wanted to purify the German peoples and, of course, gain land. In 1939, one of his close little group, Himmler, directed massive population transfers, as they're called. Ethnic Germans were going to move into the Reichland, for Lebensraum, which is another German word. It's called living room, and it's not the living room like you and I have. It's a place for the Germans to have room to live. Poles and Jews were deported to the east, and a campaign of terror was begun. Most of the Poles, if they weren't killed outright, they were forced into labor camps. And of course, there were special death squads that just would shoot a Jew in the street if he saw him. And where were the camps? And the local population said they didn't know what was going on. Oh, give me a break. If you've ever burned your finger, you know how it hurts and how it smells. You knew something was going on. In 2013, historians compiled a list of more than 42,000 separate extermination camps, detention centers, ghettos, and slave labor sites in German-controlled Europe. The conclusion was that virtually every population center was close to such a site. It's caused most historians to revise their estimates of who in Europe had knowledge of this extermination policy. But there again, it goes back to what I just said. Do you actively help? Do you look the other way? Or do you risk your life to help these people? Rising Kampf, the racial struggle. It was radicalized by the war itself because the Jews have been targets for massacres and extermination ever since they've been around. But June 1941 was a turning point. Barbarossa was a big mistake by Hitler. There was no clear overarching plan. Just the driving force of Holocaust actions came with rivalries within the Nazi bureaucracy. 5.5 million military prisoners, and most of them were Slavic. The death squads killed over 2.2 million Jews, and by 1943, the Warsaw and Lodz ghetto were nothing but death and terror. When he wasn't busy extending his territory, he was busy killing people. Nazis' plan for mass killing began in 1941. No Jew would be allowed to leave an occupied area. They started out trying to exterminate them by putting them in a room and running a hose from taking a hose and putting it on the exhaust pipe of a truck that was running with the fumes and tried to kill them this way. But then they came up with another plan, Auschwitz and Birkenau, systematic annihilation of Jews and Gypsies. In 1-2 year period, more than 1 million were exterminated. That was in the camps, but there was other slaughters too. People were tortured, beaten, and executed publicly. They'd sometimes have death marches with the Jews and the other people that were undesirable, just for pure fun for them and torture. And they had a reserve police battalion called 101 from Hamburg, Germany, which did its job very well. Hitler's final solution: the Jews were marked for death. On January the 20th, 1942, the officials met at Wannsee, just outside of Berlin, to discuss the, quote, final solution, quote, to the Jewish problem. They also discussed what they thought to be the remaining number of Jewish people in the territories they controlled or soon hoped to control. But no matter how you look at it, extermination involved the knowledge and cooperation of a lot of people. Engineers, municipal officials, train drivers, people who lived in or near the camps. With more than 42,000 camps and ghettos, no way to hide it. And anybody who suspected the worst were terrified and powerless. And the sad thing was that most people in Europe believed that there really was a Jewish problem. Nazis had in the beginning tried to conceal the death camps, but it got support for other actions. I mean, what about the other governments? Somebody, like I said, somebody had to drive the trains, somebody had to drive the trucks. Almost every European nation cooperated in some respect, usually with nothing more than deportations, because once you put them on a truck and drive them out of your town, it's no longer your problem, right? Vichy France cooperated with deportation. Italians participated, but not quite as actively. The Hungarian government dragged its feet when it came to deportation, helping to save as much of the Jewish population as they could in Hungary. But the camps were designed to make resistance difficult. Yes, there were some rebellions at Auschwitz and Treblinka, brutally crushed. Escape during a roundup of the people trying to escape was impossible. In the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, 80% of the residents had already been deported, but 56,000 Jews were still left and they were killed. So what was the human cost of this war? 6 million Jews killed, of which 2.9 million were Polish. Some Jewish communities in the Polish area were totally annihilated. 200,000 Romanian people, 250,000 people with disabilities, 5.7 million non-Jewish Soviet citizens, 2.7 non-Jewish Polish civilians. These are the deportation railways all over. They would be packed into a cattle car so tight you'd have to stand up. You couldn't sit down, you couldn't lay down, you couldn't even go to the bathroom. Okay, let's leave the horrors of war for a few minutes and talk about the home front. You had to have a lot of resources and a national commitment and support. But the wartime profits were what they called the dance of the millions. Of course, Germany and Japan robbed local areas of their resources to supply their army. United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union, their people worked long shifts, and more women went to work, so it really hurt the families. And there was rationing. So even though you were working and making a good wage, you had money, there was nothing to buy. Propaganda campaigns encouraged the production of all war equipment, like loose slips, ships, Patriotism, communal interest, and a common stake in winning the war. Allies built tanks, ships, and airplanes by the tens of thousands. Every big city had some kind of a war-building machine there, where they were building airplanes or something. Germany was a little bit less efficient in the use of her workers and resources, but the pet projects of some of the Nazis expended a lot of time and money, like working on the atomic bomb. Centers of bombing, yeah, they were targets. Centers of industry were first military targets. Now, the American and the British strategic bombing was ruthless. The British wanted a war of retribution, just wipe them off the face of the earth. The Americans, they felt, let's just grind Germany down without sacrificing too many allies' lives. But the bombing of Germany, once it began, continued day and night from 1943 on. And tens of thousands of German citizens were killed in the bombing. And then there's the Dresden bombing, which today even we still debate why it was happening. It was retribution. It was not a major production or even an industrial center for the Germans. It was a place that made glassware. Between 35,000 and 135,000 civilians dead, and the city was destroyed. It was to prove it could be done. But what about this race to build a bomb? Now, Germany was doing it. Nuclear fission and the chain reaction, but only the U.S. had the resources to build it before the war's end. Everybody else is pouring money into the military. Enrico Fermi led a group of physicists, including refugees from the fascist regimes, and built the first nuclear reactor at the University of Chicago in 1942. Then they moved to Los Alamos, New Mexico, because they were fearing a German bomb. The U.S. began to really push and build a lab at Los Alamos. He brought together the most capable nuclear physicists. John Robert Oppenheimer directed the top-secret Manhattan Project, which is what it was called. And they had the first test of an atomic bomb on July the 16th, 1945, near Los Alamos. And I think this is, this isn't a picture of the explosion. It's going to tell you a little bit about what the bomb was and what it looked like. You think of a bomb as being long and black and dropped from a plane, but the atomic bomb wasn't that at all. Come on. It'll take longer to bring it up than it is to show it. See, it wasn't a long black cylinder. It was called Gadget, and it looked kind of strange. It looked like a powder box, didn't it? There were early Nazi successes as they was invading into Soviet Union, but the siege of Leningrad, the city held out for 844 days. That's a couple of years. Russian partisans stepped up to guerrilla warfare. Men, women, and children, civilians, all were in it. The Russians rallied to save the motherland. Like I said, they loved their country. They lay down and died. They would take corpses of their own people and build a barricade. But the Russian winners took a heavy toll. Astonishing recovery of Soviet industry after the war, when the whole industry was rebuilt beyond the Urals. Whole populations moved to work in the new factories, trying to get away from the Germans and during the war. And the German lines were very overextended. Does it sound familiar to you? Russian winter, lines overextended, supply lines, yeah. But Germany shifts the thrust of the war south toward Russian oil. If we can't take Moscow, we'll take their oil. And the Russians drew the Germans into Stalingrad for brutal city, street-to-street fighting. Now, this Blitzkrieg army didn't know how to do street-to-street, house-to-house fighting. They were used to bringing in the tanks and the planes, and this wasn't working. The house-to-house fighting kind of neutralized the German tanks. And in November of 42, the Russian army counterattacked in winter, which they could handle, and surrounded the city. But Hitler refuses to retreat. Unfortunately, the German 6th Army surrendered much against his orders, and more than 500,000 German, Italian, and Romanian soldiers were killed. But there was over 1 million Soviet deaths, and they gladly died for their country. It's sad to say, but they did. 1943 Kursk, the largest battle ever fought. Ukraine is back in Soviet hands, and Romania was knocked out of the war. And then the Soviets had victories in Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia. And does it sound like the Russians are clearing out the Germans from Europe? Yes, they are. Soviets pressured the Allies to open a second front in the West, and Rommel's invasion of Egypt was defeated at Al Alamein, and Bernard Montgomery leads his Desert Rats, which were the anti-tank people in Egypt. And of course, Prime Minister Churchill said it's the end of the beginning. United States, Britain, and the Free French troops invaded French territories of Algeria and Morocco. Then they invaded Sicily, then Italy. And in Italy, Mussolini was deposed. His mistress and he were both executed and hung by the feet on a lamppost. And then Italy surrendered in the summer of 43. Of course, the Germans that were there still continued to fight. Then on June the 6th, 1944, the most important second front of all, the Normandy invasion. This happened in June the 6th of 44, and in August, less than 60 days later, they reached Paris. Now, I guess you have figured out by this time, I am not a naval historian or military historian in any way. We don't spend time on the battles. We don't have time to spend time on the battles. If you are interested in it, there are entire courses on the Second World War, and you can even get a degree, a bachelor's degree on the Second World War, and take 4 years of it. But the Allied troops raced across France, and Patton, who is the equivalent, our equivalent tank commander, he was pretty good. He had a blitzkrieg of his own to the Rhine River. Unfortunately, he went so fast with his tanks, he ran out of gas, and the supply line couldn't get him gas for a while. But because he was out of gas, and the winter a lot comes along, and the Germans allowed to regroup, and we had something called the Battle of the Bulge in December, where the Germans started pushing back. But it didn't take long. Just a few months later, the Allies crossed the Rhine, and Germans preferred to surrender to the Americans or British than face the Russians, which I find amusing in a way. The Soviets entered Berlin in late April of 1945 with more than 100,000 Russians and Germans dead there. And the official report is Hitler committed suicide in his bunker on April the 30th of 45, and Germany surrenders unconditionally in May. Like I said, the official report is he committed suicide. There's so many theories one way or the other. Did he really survive and go to South America, or did he? We don't know. The reason we don't know, we didn't have any DNA we could test, and we didn't even have his head or his body. The Russians had that. The British, Indian, and Nepal troops liberated Burma. The Australians recaptured the Dust East Indies, and the island hopping was successful. So the bombing of Japan had begun back in 43, and by 44, most of the Japanese Navy had been destroyed. Okinawa fell to the Americans after 82 days of horrible fighting. So we called on Japan to surrender or be destroyed. Meanwhile, B-29s had been systematically bombing the Japanese cities, and those houses are made out of practically nothing. I couldn't believe how thin the walls were, and the paper wall. It was just terrible. But Japan refused to surrender. It was considered a disgrace, remember? But firebombing and the economic warfare was clearly destroying the Japanese ability to wage war. So they came up with a plan called the Bushido Code. And the Bushido Code was glorified suicide. It was young men trained to take off in airplanes and take the airplanes and dive into American ships. They were not set up to return. This was strictly a one-way trip. Bushido Code is something to do with the wind, and they're going to fight and die for their country. But the decision to drop the bomb, was it really necessary? Well, by this time, the American president had died and there was a new president. Some military planners argued that Japan was already beaten. Others believed an invasion was necessary, but it would cost up to 1 million Allied lives because you're going to be fighting on their territory in a mountainous region where you're fighting going uphill. And you're going to have men, women, and children fighting against you. Some scientists involved feared that we would be setting a deadly precedent. It was up to President Truman to make the decision. He could either order an invasion, which was going to cost the estimated deaths of 1 million. It was suggested, why don't we just demonstrate the bomb? We could also drop this unconditional surrender and tell them that they could just surrender and keep their emperor, because that was a big stalling point there, was we unconditional surrender and get rid of your emperor. But on August 6, 1945, we dropped a bomb on Hiroshima. But Japan still does not surrender. 3 days later, we drop another bomb on Nagasaki. And it still took almost 10 days. Well, 5 days. For the unconditional surrender on August 14th. And the problem was, we'd done so much bombing, and the headquarters in Tokyo had heard about the bomb being dropped, but they thought it was just another bomb that set set Hiroshima on fire. They didn't understand the total devastation of it until Nagasaki, and they finally realized then that we had a weapon that could wipe their little island off the map. So she surrendered. So why was the war so murderous? Technology, genocide, the global reach. And the war itself is going to influence decisions made by leaders of all the countries for the next century. Bitterness and recrimination over collaboration is going to last for years. And I love this statement: the job of reburying the dead will never be done. So what was the aftermath? Well, the products of industry had destroyed the structures of industry. Europe, vulnerable to rivalry between the United States and Soviet Union. They were in the middle. And where we had been allies, the United States and Soviet Union had been allies during the war. When the war was over, President Truman wrote in his diary he didn't trust that SOB Stalin. The impact of the 2 world wars on Western imperialism, it affected that. It had become a global matter, and campaigns were fought in and over colonial territories. The countries in Europe that had colonies, they wanted to get them back. They wanted to go back to the way things were before, but that's never going to happen. The colonial troops had served in the armies on both sides. But the wars themselves actually started the colonial independence movements. But massive killing, estimated between 62 and 78 million people died in the Second World War. Now, I know when you see numbers that big, they don't really mean anything to you. You can read your next door neighbor hit a dog and you feel sad about it, or he fell and broke his leg and you feel sad about it, but you're thinking about one person. When you're talking about 78 million people, it's just a hard number to grasp. But that concludes the lecture for Chapter 26 in World War II. And I'm sorry it took so long, but we probably could have cut 15 minutes off of it if we hadn't had to wait so long for the films. That being said, I hope you're horrified and disgusted and promise yourself you're going to be part of this never happening again.